everyone. Hi Daniel, how are you?
I'm doing good, doing good. A lot of work lately, editing videos, all that. So yeah, it's been kind of a lot of just a lot
Awesome.
of work. How's your new job?
Well, it's good. It's good. It's good. It's day two for me. So you know, it's been great. People have been wonderful. Yeah.
Sweet.
Well, just to also let everyone know, this is our second episode podcast, should I say, of the Asian American experience. Today, we talked about so much last time around, and we're going to kind of go more into detail. We wanted to talk a lot more about the history part of things, because in the first episode, we really, we spoke about it, but nothing too in depth.
Hmm.
And given what's been going on with the Asian American violence that's going on, it definitely, you kind of have to start from the beginning
Yes.
in order to understand what's happening now. So,
Yes.
yeah, go ahead, Daniel. I'm sorry.
No, no, no. Just to radiate on your point. A lot of history, and once you dive deeper into that history, you kind of realize that this is not a isolated incident,
Yeah,
but rather something that has been going on for a while. Actually, it's just more just been brought out to light.
absolutely. And I think, and definitely, we'll go through the history, but given our ages, myself and Daniel, there is a huge a lot of people coming in from Asia in the 70s, 80s, and 90s due to a lot of conflicts that were going on. Obviously, we're definitely going to talk about that.
Hmm.
But for myself, I'm an 80s child. A huge amount of Asians came to the United States from all over Asia
Hmm.
during that time. Numbers are incredible. 80s, and then also in the 90s as well, which is
Hmm.
Daniel.
Yeah, I am. I think the weird mix between Gen Z and millennial. I'm 1995. So there's a huge influx of, I believe, Koreans who came in during the 90s and Chinese
Yeah.
as well. So yeah, let's get right into it. I think before then, you know, I
Let's
think we
start.
should,
Okay,
yeah, start.
in the mid 1800s, we had a lot of there was a gold. Someone discovered gold in California in around the 1840s. There was also where the railroads were definitely growing. There were a lot of people from the east coast of the United States heading on west. So that was the railroads became very critical.
Mhm.
The Civil War then started. So then that became essential. And in order to have someone put together these railroads, a lot of immigrants from China did come to the United States. They were seen as, quote, I hate saying these words, but cheap labor.
Mhm.
So they were really responsible for a lot of the railroads that you see even today.
Mhm.
And then with that being said, the gold rush, there were also a lot of folks who were coming in from China as well, not only to dig for gold for themselves, but also other people would hire um, the again cheap labor to come in and actually search for the gold.
Yes.
It's very labor intensive. You're talking about being out in the elements for 12 to 15, 16-hour days at times. You're
Mhm.
sleeping in a tent. There's no facilities for anyone to sleep in.
Mhm.
If anyone watches kind of a Wild Wild West kind of movies and television shows, it shows you those photos of saloons and also houses that were
Mhm.
not properly built as well. So pretty similar to all of that. And then there primarily the folks that came here were Chinese men,
Mhm.
and that was predominant. So they started noticing that there were a lot of men, but there were no women
Mhm.
coming in. And so, Deanna, do you want to talk about the Page Act that was a result of
Yes.
this?
So let's go. Let's before we go into the paycheck, let's go into the reason why they hired or they brought over Chinese immigrants is if you look at California, California was a free state. And I think that's something that kind of need to talk about that because California became a state in the 1840, I think 1840 to 1850. And it was a free state. No slavery was allowed. But they still need labor. And so that's why they hired Chinese immigrants. And a lot of it, like you said, were Chinese men. A lot of these men had families back home, but they came by themselves, you know, typical American dream story, we come here to have a better life. But unfortunately, it kind of turned into a sort of indentured servanthood. And I think you said, I think you said it, I think, what was it, 20% I think by 1875, 20% of California workforce were Chinese men.
Yep.
So there was growing xenophobia, there was a growing fear of, okay, like there's a lot more than we thought. So they created the Page Act. And the reason why they created the Page Act is because they're like, okay, we have a lot of Chinese men. We don't want Chinese women. And so they created propaganda. They created a lot of, you know, a lot of xenophobia was going around. And the Page Act was enacted in 1875, and it was introduced to Congress by a congressman who was also named Page, hence the name Page Act, who was from California. And he did it to deter or to ban Chinese women from coming to this country, quote unquote, because they're immoral and prostitutes. And if you look at President Ulysses Grant's speech to Congress, I believe it was their annual speech. I forgot what it's called. I'm a poli sci major. Oh my gosh, I can't even remember the name. Speech in the Nation, or what it's called. He was like, we have to have this law, you know, like Chinese women are immoral and they're going to corrupt this country. So yeah, they did that. And then let's go into the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese men in 1882.
You know what, Daniel, actually, just to not cut you off, but I am going to cut you off. Also, one of the things about the Page Act was to prevent Chinese men from intermarrying with Caucasian women.
Yes. So what's ironic, and that was a really good point you brought up, is because whereas today Asian men are demasculized and, you know, we're not masculine enough, and it was the exact opposite back in the day where it was Chinese men who were seen as hyper masculine and hyper sexualized, and they were like having propaganda. It was like, you better get away from the China man because he's going to rape your women.
Yeah.
You know, and that's how they did it back in the day. And it's like, it's so weird just knowing like that was the history back then. Of how
you can actually still see posters of that that are still around.
There are plenty. There are a lot more than you would think. And then they did the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and I know you have some things to talk about that, so I'm going to pass the torch to you.
Well, finally, yeah. Well, the Chinese Exclusion Act, you know, was kind of building a block on top of the Page Act. So meaning like building blocks. So building another part to it is that they decided, you know what, let's just prohibit all immigration of Chinese laborers. There was a huge push from the Caucasian community in regards to they're taking our jobs. Statements like that. Also at the time, there was a panic, is what they call, which is not exactly a depression or a recession, but it's kind of a very, you know, 1 to 2 year, oh my gosh, you know, there's something going on with the economy. And it just happened to hit around that time. So you have, you know, even though it's a short time, but, you know, once that happens, once a panic hits, you have unemployment.
Yes.
So with that being said, that was why there was a huge push to the president, who was Chester Arthur, to please have this Exclusion Act made, because you also had an influx of East Coast people coming into the West Coast. So at that point, they had a lot of workforce. So it was kind of a, you know, we don't need the Chinese anymore here. They're taking away our jobs, and we have enough people now that, you know, we just don't want to do it. We just don't want you here anymore. Hence the
Yes.
Chinese Exclusion Act.
Yep.
Go ahead, Daniel.
And what people forget about Chinese Exclusion Act, and this is something I forget, it was only supposed to be in law for 10 years. But
That's right.
then the
Yep.
Gary Act of 1892 came in, and was it 1892 or yeah,
Yeah,
1892.
1892.
Yeah, and they're like, oh, let's just make it permanent. You know,
Yep.
let's you know, and it's frustrating just knowing like this is our history, and then if you look at I think moving forward or like looking back, realizing that Asian Americans or Asian people were the very first people who were banned from this country for immigrating.
Yeah.
You
Yep.
know, and
And actually, when I was in San Francisco, there's actually a tour that you can take of Alcatraz.
mm,
And there's an island there that, believe it or not, around the time of the Geary Act, where if you were coming in from China or any part of Asia, it was almost, it's basically an island where you would stay until all your paperwork got together. So very, very
wow,
similar to, yeah, and no one talks about it. So extremely similar to the East Coast situation of with the Italians being kept on an island as well, while paperwork and things of that sort. And there were people that were there for years
hmm
before they could enter the United States.
yeah, that's sad. That's a sad. That's like a reverse Ellis Island, where Ellis Island is kind of like,
Yeah.
you know, you see the Statue of Liberty and you're like, wow, like, you know,
Hmm.
I'm getting here to get my documents. It's kind of like those stories of people who are like in airports for, you know, they actually live in airports.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And you can actually, one of the museums, I believe, in the San Francisco area actually has a journal from one of the Chinese men who stayed on that island for almost 5 years, and
wow,
has his journal about what he was going through.
wow.
Yep.
So it's just insane, like how we, you know, this is how it was back in the day. But let's keep going on.
Keep going.
That 1924, that's when they pretty much banned Asian immigration in general.
Yep,
And
that's right.
they, you know, if you're from Asia in general, like I forgot what act it was exactly. You probably know on the top of your head, but just knowing in 1924, you know, they were like, yeah, we're not gonna let any Asians in. Like you're pretty
Yep.
much banned. That was yeah. So the Immigration Act of 1924, that's what it was right here. The Asian Exclusion Act. So they upgraded from Chinese to Asian Exclusion Act.
Yeah.
Um,
Excuse me. Yeah. And you know what's funny is that during that time, then you started seeing people coming into the United States that were not Chinese.
mhm,
So you started seeing people actually, the United States in the Spanish American War
yes.
got a couple of American colonies, which is Puerto Rico,
Mhm,
and at the time it was the Philippines.
yep.
Well, they decided, you know what, we need cheap labor again. So
Mhm,
it's around the year 1900. Let's have them go to Hawaii. Hawaii became very huge amounts of Filipinos coming in to pick sugar canes.
yep.
So you've had that time where that was happening, and then the Japanese were coming in
Mhm,
around that time too. I know a lot of folks, you know, they look at World War II and they say, oh, you know, Japanese Americans were in internment camps, but they were here since actually the early 1900s,
mhm, yep.
due to what would end up becoming so much of the 20th century, which is war after battle in Asia.
Mhm,
Because all this stuff in World War II didn't just start one day. This was years in the making.
mhm,
So you had, yeah, so, you know, you had Hirohito with Japan. So you had a lot of people coming in from the early 20th century
yeah.
from Japan. Um, you had communism, which was just starting out. And then you had, you know, cheap labor. So you had Filipinos. There were actually Filipinos as well. I don't know if you know this, Daniel, but in Louisiana and Georgia to do the fishing.
Yep. Super
Yep.
big and yep. Super
Yep.
big in
So there was
Louisiana.
around that time. So it's funny because you were mentioning Asian exclusion, but at the same time they needed cheap labor. So it's like it's counteracting one another at the exact same
Hmm.
period.
Yeah, they just if you look at the history of like Asia during the early 1900s, it was pretty chaotic.
Yes.
And Japan and Russia were war each other, and then Japan, that's when they started doing the expansion. So they invaded South Korea, because from the Russo-Japan War, Japan gained South Korea, and then annexed Korea. Well, not South Korea at that time, but annexed Korea. And then they started like the Japanese were like, oh, let's just go into Manchuria and China. And so it was a very chaotic time in
Mm-hmm.
Asia.
Yeah.
And I think what people forget is that there's an influx of Koreans during the 50s and 60s. But if you look back in the day, Koreans were considered to be Japanese citizens because they're
Yeah.
annexed.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
and then in China at that time, that's when the last of the kings, the royalty, were born because the Chinese nationalists, they took over
They were
during the
taking over. Yep.
1910s. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so um, it was just a very chaotic time, and then you got obviously the Opium Wars with the British Empire,
Yep.
Great
Actually,
Britain.
Daniel, I actually read that the bubonic plague hit Chinatown in San Francisco in 1900.
That's fun.
Yeah. And
Wow.
the Chinese were blamed.
Wow.
Yep. So the Chinatown was quarantined, but there were a lot of violence happening because everyone blamed the Chinese.
Chinese.
That sounds kind of familiar.
What's really weird about COVID-19, the way COVID-19 has, so people blame people blame China, the CCP, the Chinese, say like, oh, because you eat dogs and cats. If you look at the flu in 1918, the flu in 1918 started in Europe,
Mm-hmm.
but then because of World War One, because of the trench warfare, because and the virus mutated into the flu in 1918, and next thing you know, like it killed, I believe, 15 million people within a
Yep.
2-3 year span. And I don't see, and the Spanish were blamed for it,
Yes, and
but
it
then
was
like
it
the
didn't even
U.S.
start in Spain.
No, and the reason why is because if I remember correctly, they said like the Spanish king got it, so that's where the nickname came from.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at it from like an actual standpoint, the Spanish flu is actually a terrible term. It's not accurate at all because it didn't start in Spain. It got its nickname from stereotyping and from misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, in a way, it kind of sounds like COVID-19, where they kind of blame the Chinese. But if you look at the history of COVID, coronavirus in general, coronavirus interacts and changes over time. The cold is a coronavirus,
Mm-hmm.
and it just happened to mutate. Um, and unfortunately, it started in Wuhan, and then eventually it became worldwide. But somebody needs to be blamed, and the Chinese and the CCP were to blame.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, me personally, I'm not. I don't want to get political or anything. Like I have my own beef with the CCP. I think, I think, I think we all do. But but I think if you look at the history, like we as Asian Americans have been blamed for a lot of things. The fact that you talked about the Black Death,
Yeah.
they blame the Chinese for that. I'm just like, well, I'm not surprised. I mean, it seems like just the fact that this happened 100 years ago, now it's still happening now. It's like, wow, like we haven't learned a thing.
Yep. Yep. And the 20th century, especially around this time in the early 1900s, after World War One, which was chaotic all over Europe, people, I don't think the history books talk about what happened in Asia during that time.
Mm-hmm.
You had a lot of countries that were slowly opening their doors.
Yep.
They had always been isolationists. And with that just came a lot of different situations, which, led to socialism in the mid 20th century,
Exactly.
communism, and so much more. And the
Mhm.
leaders, all from, even from Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam to the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, to South Korea, North Korea, all of that came from the early 20th century.
Yeah.
All of the people, you had Mao that was born around that time, Kim Il Sung was born around that time, and it was that period from about 1890, I would say, even to like 1920-ish,
Hmm.
20 to 30, where all of it was a lot of anti-monarchy, a lot of anti-government, and it was
Hmm.
spreading.
It was spreading, and I think it also doesn't help that there was a lot of imperialism going on.
Hmm.
Indonesia was Dutch colony. Singapore was
That's right.
British. Vietnam was French.
Hmm.
China, in a way, was British. Um, the Philippines was at one point an American colony.
And it was
So
Spanish before that
it
for
was Spanish
500
before
years.
him. Yeah, and then Guam too was Spanish.
That's right.
So there was just a lot of imperialism. Hawaii, like I looked at the history of Hawaii. It's not pretty at all.
No,
Um, like
no,
some of
that
the
is not a pretty history.
no, and it's like yeah, it just look at the history of how Asians, like just that time, like it was so chaotic, so much things going on. And as someone, we're both history buffs. Like I was a poli. I think you told me you were a political
I
science
was
major as
poli sci
well.
major, yeah.
Yeah, I
Hmm.
was poli sci. Almost this close to being a dual major in history as well. But
Oh, I was dual poli sci and history, believe it or
I
not.
I was this close. I should have, but I didn't want to write more papers. There's so many papers you can write. Um,
Yeah.
but
And it's
yeah.
crazy too because our grandparents' generation, even great grandparents, I mean, this is what they've seen as well. I was
Mhm.
I was telling a friend, I was like, if you were born in 1900, can you imagine everything that you saw if you lived to be 100 and you were Asian? It would be, you could be a walking history book.
They, I can only imagine if you emigrated and came to Chinatown in San Francisco, saw how it grow,
Hmm.
see World War II, see the civil rights movements,
Yeah.
see the hippies of the 70s, see technology in the 80s,
Mhm.
um, see everything crazy going in the 90s and 2000s. Like I could just only imagine.
Yeah. But
And
what's crazy to me is that, the the Asian Americans that have been in this country, right before World War II and even World War One and all of the wars, they fought on the American side.
yep,
You
we did.
know, Asian Americans are just so proud to be American.
Yes.
Um, I remember when I was the first grandchild for my grandparents to graduate from a university, excuse me, in the United States. My grandmother
Mm,
wept.
wow.
She just wept at that fact, and it just meant so much to her. But my grandparents, my parents, just very
Mhm.
dedicated to the United States, and a lot of the people in the military are Asian.
Yes. And I think that's something that's overlooked, like in while the Japanese Americans were in internment camps, there was a large amount of Japanese Americans fighting against the
Yep.
Japanese
Yep.
people who, their ancestors, like their people, so called. But yeah, if you look at our history, like I remember the Filipinos, they were waiting for General MacArthur to come back.
Yes.
They were like, yes, please, they suffer through all that pain and suffering from the Japanese. And
Mm-hmm.
when General MacArthur came back, that was like, that was history for them. That was like, he's like our savior.
Yeah. By the way, just to let you know, there is a statue of American soldiers and MacArthur made out of gold in one of the beaches that
Wow,
they came across in the Philippines, and it's actually a huge tourist site. Like
that's
it's
pretty
been
cool, actually.
untouched. It's been untouched since MacArthur left.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Um, but yeah, let's talk about World War II. So it's like, what's interesting.
Okay.
So if you look at World War One, was pretty similar, where the Germans were, a lot of people who were German American,
Hmm.
they were kind of like antagonized, and they're like, you know, we're not drinking your German lager because we're proud
Yeah,
Americans. You
that's
bunch
right.
of
Yeah.
you go around and you're a bunch of Prussians. World War Two, I think, looking at the propaganda, like I watched I looked at some of the propaganda posters, and it kind of hurt my heart. And
Yeah.
it's like, I understand, like, the Japanese were our enemy. They bombed Pearl Harbor. They're part of the Axis power.
Hmm.
They have brutalized the Pacific, the Pacific Ocean. But it's just the way the American propaganda has really just dehumanized them, and sort
Hmm.
of, and there was so much hysteria that uh, President FDR was like, hey, let's put Americans, actual Americans who happen to be Japanese descent. I'm sorry, you have to go to internment camps, and it's like it was a violation of their constitutional rights,
Hmm. Yep.
because once you become an American citizen, you're entitled to all of your rights that's guaranteed
Hmm.
on the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, all the amendments that came out the word, and it was like they just threw that out the window. Japanese owned business, Japanese Americans owned businesses were, destroyed, raided, um,
Hmm. And there
families
were
got split
actually
up.
and the internment camps actually, I'm from Los Angeles, and I lived in a city called Arcadia, which is where Santa Anita Racetrack is.
Hmm.
And they would use the horse stalls to house one of the Japanese internment camps.
Oh my gosh.
Hmm. They would use the horse stalls at the racetrack, and they would use fields out in the middle of nowhere. Probably, I would say 3-4 hour drive north of Los Angeles in desert fields. So you were in a tent in the middle of the Mojave Desert.
I'm just not surprised.
Yeah, it's vicious. It's really awful.
It's awful, and then even after World War II, then the Korean War came out, and
And
I
and that
have,
was all about communism. It was,
yeah,
the fear of communism, and that really, really took hold. I mean, after World War II, you had the Russian Revolution, you had all these
yes,
things happening so fast, and then you had Korea, and that was, a lot of Asian Americans and Americans fought during that war as well. And it's kind
yeah.
of the forgotten war, is what its
It
its its nickname is.
it is the forgotten war, and I think what people forget is that during World War II, the communists were our friends,
Hmm.
because the Soviet Union was on our side. Because what's ironic is Hitler, as much as he hated France and Great Britain and democracy, Hitler really hated the communists, like really hated the communists, and he pushed the largest land invasions against the Soviets, took him by surprise, 3 million troops on the Eastern Front. And I remember the iconic photo, FDR, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin were sitting together, in their summits. And then within like a year, Winston Churchill was like, there's an iron curtain. The communists are not our friends. And then that started, then Truman came into power. President Truman, he created the Truman Doctrine. I forgot what's the exact policy, but it was like containment. Like the containment policy got into full effect, which is we're trying to contain communism. We can't let any more countries fall into communism. And the next proxy war came out, and that was Korea.
Mm-hmm.
When the North Koreans, because Korea was divided in 1948 on the 30th parallel. And then in 1950, North Korea came into Seoul, South Korea, with the help of Russians, and almost took over Korea in 3 days until the UN sent in troops to try to liberate South Korea.
Now,
And
Daniel, do you have any, was your family, any family history about the Korean War from?
I have a lot of history. So my father's side got hit really, really hard. So my father's side were pretty wealthy. And what people don't know about Korea is that North Korea is significantly bigger than South Korea.
Mm-hmm.
And North Korea has a lot of natural resources, like a lot more than South Korea, mostly because it's very mountainous. So my dad's family, they were operating gold mines.
Okay.
And 6 of their gold mines were located in North Korea. They only had 2 in South Korea. When the Korean War came out, they lost everything.
Oh, geez.
This is a crazy story. So my aunt, she before she passed away at the age of 73, me and her were talking, and she told me that when she was 3 years old, because she was born in 1947, that's when the Korean War happened, and they were living in Seoul, and an artillery strike hit their house where my aunt was living at in her room, and it exploded, and then she flew out of the house from the blast radius
Oh my
and somehow
gosh.
survived. And
Oh,
the Korean
wow.
War, in a way, is pretty personal to me because this notion of like how people call us like, oh, you're communist and you're the CCP or you're a North Korean spy or all this, and it's like, dude, like my family fought against communism. My family fought against the CCP. My family fought against the North Korean, Jujutsu ideology. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it hurts a lot, and I don't care. They're like, oh, I'm joking and stuff. It's like I don't see me going around joking about how, you're American and all. It's like it's like we've just always been easy targets, and it's like just knowing like for years like they just consider us to be easy targets for propaganda, to just make fun of, to dehumanize, to demasculize, to hypersexualize. That's how it became.
Yeah.
So yeah, the Korean War
Wow.
is pretty personal. Just knowing my family side of it. So
Wow. So now were you born in Korea or were you born and raised here in the United States?
I was born and raised here in the States, yes.
Okay.
Um,
When did your
but
family come over to the US?
so my mother came over here in 1980. She married a U.S. Army soldier officer. They eventually got divorced, and then my father came here in 1992. Mother and father met in Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so they didn't meet in Korea. Actually, they met here in the States,
Mhm.
which is very different from a lot of a lot of my family, or not family, but a lot of my friends' family, where their parents came directly from South Korea and they
Mhm.
immigrated here to the United States.
That will be
Um,
another episode, ladies and gentlemen, because mine is the
yes,
same story. My
yeah,
parents both met here in the United States, and I was born here in the United States.
yeah. It's this it's kind of crazy. But yeah, I'm kind of curious, like how was the um from your family history, like how was like the American occupation and sort of like after the Philippines,
Oh,
they got
sure.
their independence.
Yeah. So my mom's side, my grandfather actually would help out American soldiers
Wow.
by giving them rice, which was rationed at the time.
Mm,
So he would kind of, pretty much feed a lot of the soldiers. My grandmother as well. My grandmother owned acres and acres and acres of rice fields. So she was the same way. World War II, my grandmother actually told me she would hide in the basement when the Japanese came,
Hmm.
and the Americans came. So there was she went to a boarding school, and there was like a button you would press, and they would have these emergent, like every single day, kind of, emergency preparation for what's going to happen. And then when it
Hmm.
finally did happen, she went to a basement and she said she ate canned food for like a month.
Wow.
Yeah. So growing up, definitely food was, we adored food. We ate a lot
Hmm.
because of that. So it was really personal for my mom's parents. And then my dad's side, my grandmother was working at the university there, and then met my grandfather, who was trying to flee communism.
Mm.
And he's Chinese, and so they met and got together at that time.
Hmm.
So, and that was around 1935-ish.
Yeah, this is right during the Civil War going on, or I think this is
Yeah.
like because they stopped fighting around I think 1937, the communists and the
Mm-hmm.
nationalists, because
Yeah.
Manchuria's invaded, and then Nanking.
Nanking, yeah.
Man, that Nanking is they did some Japanese. I think if you look at the history of Asia, there's a lot of unsettled beef going on between a lot of the Asian countries, especially with people with either China or Japan, because Japan has done some. China, Japan, China is the one who conquered everybody else. Japan
Mm-hmm.
is the one that had unfortunately committed a lot of atrocities.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and we're just gonna keep it real over here, and that's just, it's a different story now, but I think that explains the sort of tribalism that happens in Asian culture, and I think that's why, even to this day, even with all the hate crimes going on against Asian Americans, um, particular group of people will be like, oh, I don't care because they're Chinese,
Yeah.
or like, I don't care because they're Koreans. It's just kind
Yeah.
of a sad reality instead of us kind of unifying, because these racists are so racist. They're so full of hate, and they're so, I guess, ignorant to the point where like they can't even get their racism right. I mean, I think I told you this.
Yeah. Yep.
Japanese ramen restaurant got raided with China virus, and go back to China, and the owners are Vietnamese, and I was like, well, these racists are so stupid they can't even get their racism right. It's like,
Yeah.
wow, but that's how they see us. They don't care.
And I think
Um,
I think it got worse. After the Harry Truman's time. I think, that, because
yeah,
that's when Vietnam starts. You
yes,
got the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think the I think the Vietnam War could probably take up 5 podcasts. Honestly,
can't
it's
really talk too
what
much
I
about it.
yeah, what Dandelion would love to do is to have someone who is a war veteran
Hmm.
from the Vietnam War, or someone who has had experience with that situation. It's such a turbulent time in the United States past. Um, there's, no matter what political side, it's just heartbreaking in regards to, because many of them are still alive.
Yeah,
And what happened in Vietnam and with our American veterans is tragic.
I really, what people forget about the Vietnam War is not an actual war. We never actually declared war in Vietnam, and that's what people forget. And that's what created an act after the Vietnam War, where you have 90 days before you have to declare war. And that's what, because the Vietnam War was that devastating. I mean, 50,000 American soldiers died,
Hmm.
and on top of that, just countless deaths, civilians, Agent Orange.
Hmm.
But I think the Vietnam War was so unique about it was just how both sides were so brutal to their own people.
Yep.
The North were communists, and they were pretty brutal and, tyrannical, whereas South Vietnam, they were so-called democratic. But then what people forget about that 1963 photo of the Buddhist monk who set himself on fire was that the president at that time, who was Catholic, was very brutal towards the Buddhists.
Yeah.
And you know, in a way, like both governments were really terrible.
Yeah.
It's kind
Yeah.
of like a, you know, and that's why I think there's sort of a resentment towards in Vietnam towards like, well, I was saying Vietnam, but I guess like even to this day, like I think people in Vietnam, like a lot of them are anti-communism, but a lot of them are also, if they're Buddhists, they were like, well, you know, the South Vietnamese weren't the best as well.
Yeah.
Because of that president. So
If anyone is interested, I'm a huge documentary person, Daniel as well, just if in case you're
yes.
interested. Ken Burns has a fantastic PBS documentary on the Vietnam War.
Mm,
It gets emotional
yeah.
a lot, but I highly recommend it if anyone's interested in finding out the details, because it's a lot. It's a lot it's a lot out there. And what I enjoyed most was that it was all consolidated into this
Mhm.
documentary.
I think just knowing that a lot of people who I think that's what kind of hurts about, like, so especially here in Denver. You
Mm-hmm.
notice too, Denver has a large Vietnamese population,
Mm-hmm.
and they're all refugees. They all fled communism. It's sort of like how this notion where I can just only imagine those who fled communism from Vietnam, who have seen their families, you know, probably got murdered or just, you know, brutalized. You know, they try to flee that, and for Americans to tell them like they are communists and that they're part of the CCP. I can't imagine the pain that they might feel, just like, wow, like these Americans are saying that I'm a part of something that I was literally trying to flee from. You know, and it's because that's the biggest thing that they try to, you know, try to attack Asian Americans is like, oh, you know, you're all CCP and China
Mm-hmm.
virus and you're all communists, and you know, it's
Mm-hmm.
like, wow, like they really, like it's so heartbreaking.
It is. And you know, it's even sadder, I think, is that it didn't even stop there. Then you had Cambodia
Mm,
in the late 70s with the Khmer Rouge. And that's
oh,
horrific as well. Not that, I mean, horrific is, I want to
yeah.
put it out there. There's no other word I can think of to describe any of this, but tragic, horrific. It just feels like just beyond words.
Pol Pot was just
Ugh.
brutal, and it also, if you look at and this is something we also need to bring up, we need to bring up the people who in Asian, so like, you know, like the income gap in America is pretty bad. We Asians have the largest income gap. And if you look at the people who are at the top or at the very bottom, uh, Hmongs are one of the people who are considered to be, let me look it up, but and the Hmongs, they were hit hard with communists and with Pol Pot. Um, but yeah, I mean, you can, I know you probably know more about the income gap between
It's
Asians.
it's it's huge. You've got this. You have Hmongs, Vietnamese, Cambodians, Filipinos, and there is this kind of a North versus South East Asia kind of situation where you have
Yeah,
Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Americans who are stereotyped as making more than people who are from the Southeast Asia side. So the countries that I mentioned right now, which are Vietnam, Cambodia, Hmong, like
the
Daniel was
Hmong,
saying, in the Philippines.
the Hmong has probably one of the highest. So I'm looking at an article, and it says that in 2018, 10.1% of Asian Americans live in poverty. Wow.
Yeah.
And the poverty level, so Filipino Americans faces 6%, whereas Hmong Americans faces 16.2%,
Wow.
which is very, very high. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's
And you know,
also,
And definitely, down the line with our podcast, we are definitely going to be addressing all of these things. We're just kind of going over certain things right now, but this obviously, all of these things that Daniel and I have spoken about is really going to, we're going to definitely elaborate more and give more information as we continue this podcast. But yeah, this is fascinating to know, and really sad when we
Yeah,
think about it.
it
I
really
mean,
is
that was
sad.
literally the 20th century. That was the 20th century.
Yeah, and we haven't touched in today about what's going on today.
Yep.
And
Yep.
and I think the reason why we're diving into history, me personally, is because someone told me, when I try to bring up about the paycheck and all that, are like, well, why do you care? It happened so long ago. But this is the same guy who also got pissed off that the Confederacy, the statues of the Confederacy were getting torn down. And you over here mad about your history. But then the moment I try to talk about my history, they're like, oh, like, suck it up, Buttercup. Pull up your bootstraps. Don't worry about the past. And well, if you look at the past, it explains a lot of what's going on today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the
And
past
because
tends to repeat itself.
always will, it always will,
Mm-hmm.
honestly. And I think, I fear a lot. I do feel a lot of anger, but also feel a lot of sadness, but also a kind of a deep desire to know more of, like, can
Yes.
we do to kind of, okay, now we're looking into the history, but now what we can do to rewrite that narrative and to see what we can do to rewrite that history.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I mean,
And I think,
yeah.
yeah. And for me, history is so important because I think that you have to take a look at what has
Mhm.
happened to understand what's going on today.
You have to, yes.
I mean, these things just don't fall from the sky. It's not like, oh, today, it happened that somebody in Georgia went up and shot, these Asian massage parlors.
Yep.
There's a history with all of that. Um, and you know what? It is an awful, tragic situation, but at the same time, we can all learn from it and really understand the past, and that way we can just have better knowledge uh, about what is, how first of all, how far we have come, and
Hmm.
we still have such a long way to go.
Yeah, we do, and I think just knowing that Robert Long's rhetoric was almost eerily similar to the Page Act's rhetorics scares me.
Mhm.
You know, and I think it doesn't it like people love to, like, kind of like gaslight Asian Americans, be like, oh, you know what's going on in those massage parlors,
Mhm.
and I was like, how do you know? And it's like, not even then. It's like, okay, then we need to also tackle why is such a high demand in the first place. Where did this? Because growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, there's a lot of sex work going on, and the sex work transcends, race. It transcends
Yeah.
even gender.
Mhm.
You know, sexual orientation. So, but we need to kind of figure out, like, why does he have this mindset of Asian women?
Mhm.
And just knowing, like, the Garner Act was like, hey, they're moral, they're corrupting our men, they're corrupting our society, and our prostitutes. Kind of the same thing Robin Long said, pretty
Mhm.
much.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well,
like you
Daniel,
said,
this was, yeah.
history
No, go
repeats
ahead.
itself. I know that's all I'll say. History repeats itself, like you said. But I'm gonna shut up now.
No, no worries. Well, Daniel, it was great speaking with you. And yeah, stay tuned for our next podcast. And have a great week and see you next
Yeah, you
time.
as well. And just to let you know, we are dropping a podcast every single Wednesday. So stay tuned every Wednesday.